Well, yesterday I was in a hurry and I broke one of my expensive Shapton ceramic whetstones. It was the 1000 grit, the yellow one here. And fortunately, it wasn't one of the finer stones. Those are even more expensive. This one I think I could replace for about 60 bucks online. But I thought, well, let's try to see if we can repair this. And I Googled, and one gentleman had talked about epoxying this broken stone to a flat surface, and he suggested using something that's impermeable to water, not just plywood, but in this case, this Corian countertop material, which is an acrylic material. This I got at a restore, a used home materials store, and I got a bigger piece. It was a part of a vanity countertop, I think, that was used, and somebody had donated. And for $5, I got a big piece of this, like 2 by 2 feet, and I cut out of that with a bandsaw a piece of this Corian that's just the same size as the ceramic whetstone, which happened to be about 7 centimeters wide by 21 centimeters long. And this seems like a pretty flat surface, and it's just under a half-inch thick is what the countertop material I found, which seems good because it's a rigid. If it was any thinner than that, it might flex or something or break. So I think this is strong enough. It's pretty strong material, and you could cut it with standard woodworking tools. There's a good video online of a guy who built a countertop out of this stuff using just hand tools. It does dull your tools quicker because it's a pretty hard plastic material with alumina in it, but it cut just fine on the bandsaw and left a pretty good surface where the cuts are. I didn't feel the need to sand it or anything, but you could. And so what I'm going to do is try to glue this broken stone back together with epoxy and glue it to the surface of this Corian material. So that's where I'm at with it. We'll see how well this works. I figured I didn't have much to lose on this. Here's the clamping arrangement I decided on using these big spring clamps, and I've got the whetstone sandwiched between the piece of Corian on the bottom that I'm going to epoxy it to, and then another piece of the same kind of Corian on the top, that just to distribute the pressure of the clamps and try to keep the stone pressed flat against the bottom plate that we're epoxying it to. So we'll see how this works. I've got a couple of pieces of scrap wood underneath there running across just to get it up off the bench so I could get those spring clamps in there easily. So here's the setup I came up with to try to hold the two halves of the broken whetstone together lengthwise. I haven't put the epoxy on yet. I'm just doing a dry run here to make sure all the clamps and everything will work, but I think I'm going to use this bar clamp to kind of hold the broken joint where the epoxy is and squeeze out any of that before I put this other plate on top here, and then add these spring clamps to kind of to squeeze out any epoxy and hold it flat against this lower piece of Corian. And then I guess I can remove this and put a couple more spring clamps on each end once that's clamped securely to the bottom plate. At least that's what I'm thinking. I'm going to have to watch out not to glue the epoxy, this piece, if any glue squeezes out of here. I think what I'm going to do is put a little piece of wax paper over there. I'm going to try to clean off the epoxy first. Just scrape it off with a little sharpened tongue depressor. But then there might still be a little, so I think I'll put a little piece of wax paper over here and then put that other plate on top here. And I'm going to get the whole arrangement kind of warm before I do this. So, because there'll be no going back once I put that epoxy on there. So hopefully I'll have enough time though with the long set epoxy to mess with it. So I'm almost ready to try the epoxy on this Shapton whetstone. One of the things I did was I saw somewhere online that use a little vinegar and some hot water to clean off your whetstone. So I did that. This is the top side, but the bottom side with the writing on it, which is where I'm going to epoxy it to this corian. I cleaned off that as best I could with the vinegar water, and also the broken edge there. I tried to clean that too. I'm going to try to put some epoxy in there just a little bit to try to hold it all together before I epoxy it all down to here. I roughed up the smooth side of this corian with some 180 grit coarse sandpaper, and then I used a little bit of alcohol on a paper towel to clean that off real good and get any any dirt or any grease or anything off of there. So hopefully the epoxy will stick to it pretty well. I also read that that was a good thing to do, was to rough it up and clean it off with alcohol. So this is the thing. I'm going to use this extra time 60-minute epoxy. I don't think you'd want to use the quick set because you might need a little more time to mess with this, and I don't know, I think the extra time epoxy is maybe a superior one for the bond that you ultimately get. One thing I have noticed with epoxy is it helps to have the epoxy to be a little warm, to flow in on there easier, and to squeeze out easier because it's pretty viscous stuff. And I think also to have these pieces warm. So I'm going to use the hair dryer and warm them up a little bit before I squeeze it all together. I don't know if I'll be able to get that the actual spreading of the epoxy on there on the camera, because I do have a tripod, but I don't know if it's going to work, and I'm going to have to work pretty quick. So I'm going to mix the epoxy with this tongue depressor in a little cup, and then I'm going to put it on here, and I'm going to spread it out, and try to make a nice even thin layer of it, because I really don't want any thickness of it there. I just want enough to hold the stone there, and also put a little epoxy in here to try to hold this stone together. I'm trying to think if I should clamp the ends of this to try to hold the whole stone together while I clamp the sandwich. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that though, so that's where I'm at. So here's the final clamping arrangement. After I've applied the epoxy and cleaned off all the squeeze out, I use that long clamp in the background to kind of pull the two broken pieces of whetstone together lengthwise. And after everything was clamped with the spring clamps with that plate on top, I removed that long clamp and put two more spring clamps on, one on each end. Had a couple of those spring clamps break on me. They're old cheap Harbor Freight kind, and they broke on me in the middle of it, so I had to use this long one here. But anyway, we'll see how that looks tomorrow after this epoxy is cured. Well, now it's the next morning, and I've taken off those spring clamps and gotten rid of my messy paper towels that had all the epoxy on it. And so then I'm going to so here's my sandwich and my layer on the top that's just for backing. And this just can come off now. It hopefully isn't stuck on there too tight. Yeah, it's not really glued on there at all. And now you can see my Shapton waterstone with my little wax paper there that was supposed to prevent that epoxy squeeze out from sticking to this corian there. So this I could just take off, and there it is. I've got it epoxied onto this bottom plate of corian, and obviously it's a little bit messy around the edges and on top here, but I'm going to now flatten the stone, or use my my flattening plate and clean off this little bit of epoxy that's here. It feels pretty smooth, but there's just a little bit of epoxy here that I need to clean off, so I'll do that next. Okay, I used the flattening plate to remove any of that little epoxy squeeze out, and it's pretty flat now. And I'm reasonably pleased with this result. You can certainly see the crack, but you can't really feel it with your finger. So I think it'll be just fine for sharpening. And the corian on the bottom I think is going to work well, be pretty waterproof. And I've got this piece for the next time I break my next sharpening stone. So that's it. I think we're back in business. See ya. Bye. Well, I've got some afterthoughts on this project. If I were to do this again, the only thing I would do different, I wouldn't put the epoxy on the broken surface there, because I could have had a much better joint, I think, if I just had the epoxy down here but not on the break. And this is okay, and it's going to work fine for sharpening, but as you could see, when I put these two pieces together, before I put the epoxy on, they fit. You couldn't even see the break. So I think that's the key. And this, there's just a little bit of epoxy in there that you can't squeeze out. Plus, it tends to slide because of that slippery epoxy in there. So if I hadn't done that, I think it would have fit even better together. So that's my advice for a future project. So that's it. Bye.